had decided we'd done everything we could, and there was time to go on or be buried, as far as casting is concerned, in this kind of part. So that was my decision.
Few TV characters touched audiences as deeply as Edith Bunker. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't flawless, she was real. When All in the Family slayed her off, fans were devastated. But was it just an actor's choice, or something more? Behind the laughter and the applause, the decision carried shocking truths that forever altered television. Why did Jean Stapleton walk away from such an iconic role? How did Norman Lear handle the fallout? And what legacy did Edith leave behind? Today, we uncover everything. We'll explore Edith's creation, Stapleton's career, the cultural storm, and the lasting impact of her departure. The dingbat who changed television. When All in the Family premiered in 1971, audiences didn't quite know what to make of Edith Bunker. She wasn't glamorous, sophisticated, or particularly sharp-witted. In fact, Archie himself regularly dismissed her as a dingbat, a nickname that, in most sitcoms, would have doomed her to being nothing more than a one-note punchline. Yet, Jean Stapleton turned that supposed weakness into her greatest strength. By embracing Edith's naivety while injecting warmth, compassion, and subtle wisdom, she transformed what could have been a forgettable sidekick into the emotional heartbeat of one of television's most groundbreaking shows. From the start, Edith was crafted as Archie Bunker's opposite. Archie, played by Carroll O'Connor, was loud, opinionated, and abrasive. He embodied the stubborn resistance of America's older generation, grappling with civil rights, feminism, and cultural shifts of the 1970s. Edith, on the other hand, represented patience, kindness, and enduring love. She softened Archie's rough edges and gave viewers a reason to stick around when his tirades went too far. Without Edith's gentle presence, Archie might have been intolerable. With her, he became human, because Edith reminded audiences that even the most flawed person had someone who loved them. Jean Stapleton went well beyond playing dumb with Edith by filling her with contradictions. A woman who seemed scatterbrained but often spoke the most piercing truths. Meek, but could stand up to Archie when it really mattered. Audiences would be lulled by the high pitch of her voice and her hesitant mannerisms, and struck by surprising flashes of wisdom. In this way, she helped make her not only relatable, but revolutionary. She was a reflection of so many women of her generation housewives who endured dismissiveness while quietly carrying families on their own backs. It was her anti-taboo stance that differentiated Edith. While Archie ranted about politics or hurled insults, Edith often became the character who humanized the debate. She would give voice to themes associated with women's rights, sexual misconduct, and health issues, places of heavy subject matter that ordinary viewers could relate to. In the episode where Edith has a problem, she demonstrated menopause on-screen subject so rarely seen on television at the time. Edith then proceeded to dispense with all polite social conventions and talked openly about confronting breast cancer in Edith's Christmas Story. On Edith's 50th birthday, she found courage and resilience following an attempted assault in one of the most shocking sitcom episodes ever aired. Stapleton embedded sincerity into every one of those moments, allowing Edith to transcend being a character and become a trusted friend throughout living rooms in America. This was not the result of coincidence. Stapleton had worked on a stage for several years before appearing on television, and she treated Edith just as any other complicated dramatic role. She purposely shaped her mannerisms, the fluttering hands, the nasal queen's accent, the exaggerated pauses. Even her off-tone singing in the celebrated opening theme, "Those Were the Days," was a choice carefully concocted to show Edith's unrefined, real quality. The character could never feel like an actress in costume. Edith came off as a person who might just possibly live down the street from you, and that was exactly what made fans love her. After some seasons, Edith graduated from being just Archie's counterfoil, but she became the heart and soul of the show. That gave Edith's audience the opportunity to see, at least on her, the soft underbelly of Archie's hard exterior. Chap hadn't craved thy love. He merely wished to communicate that decency could prevail even in bigotry and conflict. Her so-called dingbat qualities would become instead symbols of endurance, humor, and unconditional love. No doubt it is not an exaggeration for us to say that Edith Bunker sort of began redefining what a sitcom wife could be. Lucy Ricardo or June Cleaver had nothing on these ladies, no glamour associated with Lucy or perfect integration, as with June. But she was real, relatable, and funny. Yet the woman who embodied Edith never wanted to be trapped in her shadow forever. Jean Stapleton's hidden struggle. To millions of viewers, Jean Stapleton was Edith Bunker. For nearly a decade, she had embodied the role so convincingly that audiences assumed the actress and the character were one and the same. People on the street would call her Edith, not Jean, and they often expected her to act with the same wide-eyed innocence and ditzy humor they saw on television. But behind the scenes, Stapleton was an accomplished performer with decades of theater experience, and she quietly carried a fear that Edith was becoming both her blessing and her curse. Stapleton's career didn't begin with television fame. She had spent years honing her craft in Broadway productions, supporting musicals like Damn Yankees and Funny Girl, and establishing herself as a serious stage actress. To her, Edith Bunker was just one role, an important one, yes, but not the totality of her artistic ambition. She didn't want to be frozen in time as the dingbat when she knew she had the range to tackle Shakespeare, Chekhov, or complex dramatic parts. Yet, as All in the Family grew into a phenomenon, she realized that Edith's shadow was spreading wider than she ever anticipated. When she was at her peak, Stapleton rode it through and won 3 Emmy Awards and 2 Golden Globes for Edith. The unmistakably apparent talent was validated, but changes were not apparent as she became a victim of what casting directors could see in a very narrow band. In fact, she even became anxious that her high-pitched voice, quirks in mannerisms, scatterbrained charm would always see her as Edith in the eyes of her fans. Every time Stapleton stepped into a different stage or variation, she was still considered Edith in the eyes of the audience. Such typecasting could feel like one is trapped, perhaps in a golden cage. Yet, it confines you with restriction. It also had its toll, however. It was not easy for her to play Edith. While audiences adored the humor, Stapleton knew that bleakness lay just below the surface. In Bittersweet Love, enduring Edith loved her, but at times her husband Archie would deride her. "You're such a fool." That dynamic for Stapleton needed to balance comedy with its deeper truth. So many real women endure that kind of dismissal from their marriages. The demand for such a character, half joked, half sainthood, wasn't something one could discard after a day's shoot. By the time the 9th season of All in the Family rolled around, Stapleton had already begun hinting that it was time for her to move on. She had poured everything into Edith, and she feared that keeping it up now would only dilute the character even more in viewers' minds. To continue beyond this point, she believed, would jeopardize Edith's chances of being herself rather than becoming an exaggerated stereotype. It wasn't a happy realization. Stapleton loved Edith, and she loved working with Carol O'Connor and all the others. But for all those things, she knew her being an actress must be bigger than one unforgettable role. A conversation with the show's creator, Norman Lear, was based on both respect and sorrow. He was also at a loss as to how he could ever explain to such a person not only losing Edith, but also how it would figure the loss to himself. He reportedly told Stapleton, "To me, she isn't just a character." But Stapleton stood firm. Edith was fictional, yes, but Jean Stapleton was very real, and she had more stories to tell than the ones trapped inside 704 Hauser Street. It wasn't that Stapleton stepped down in a huff or from sheer exhaustion. Rather, it was a deliberate act of self-care. Stapleton was protecting her career as well as Edith's legacy. She felt the character was better off with dignity than disappearing into the shadows. This choice, in a sense, shows her respect for Edith. She had no wish for audiences to tire of her. She certainly would not tolerate them seeing her regarded as some caricature. But when Stapleton made her decision, Norman Lear faced a choice no producer wanted: replace Edith or bury her. Why Edith's death was inevitable. Once Jean Stapleton made the difficult decision to leave, Norman Lear and the creative team behind All in the Family, and its continuation, Archie Bunker's Place, were left with a problem unlike any they had ever faced. How do you continue a series when its most beloved character is gone? For Lear, Edith wasn't just another role to be recast or quietly written out. She was the heart of the show, the one person who softened Archie and anchored the family dynamic. Removing her without explanation would feel dishonest. Replacing her with another actress? Unthinkable. This is why Edith's death became not just an option, but an inevitability. Lear believed that Edith was too singular to be replicated. Stapleton had given her quirks, warmth, and contradictions that no other performer could capture. Viewers would reject any substitute as inauthentic, and the risk of tarnishing Edith's legacy was too great. So, Lear took the bold path. Edith's story had to end. The method of that conclusion was just as important. The writing staff could have scripted an over-theatrical on-screen death, but Lear and Stapleton felt Edith deserved a dignified death without the flamboyance. Her death wouldn't turn into a collar-jerking cryathon or a ratings stunt. She would simply die, quietly and conveniently off-screen, from a stroke. This smacked of how death normally comes in the course of real life. Sudden, quiet, and shattering. Fitting for a program that had taken pride in its authenticity, this choice was made. That decision threw shockwaves behind the scenes. By the late 70s and early 80s, television wasn't used to major characters dying, especially in sitcoms. Death wasn't dealt with much at all, and when it was softened or treated symbolically. Slaying off Edith broke that unspoken rule of TV, that the audiences could always count on their comfort characters to be there. The breaking of this expectation was what Lear was doing, mapping television into uncharted emotional territory. This comes, too, with the intentions of Stapleton. For Lear had always been direct. If Edith were left alive somewhere in the universe of the show, the audiences would keep pinning on hope that she might return. The death of Edith in the narrative strand would have ensured closure in Stapleton and clarity. No more lingering what-ifs, no more chances of Edith climbing through the door in season whatever. It was final and, therefore, honest. In many ways, Edith's death echoed the arc of All in the Family itself. The series had always been about facing unpalatable truths: racism, sexism, war, class wars. Death was the last taboo it had not confronted head-on. In this last moment, Edith's death opened the door to that final taboo all sitcoms for decades had skirted around: mortality. It made both Archie and the audience deal with loss, grief, and the painful fact that life does not always tie things up neatly with a bow. For Carroll O'Connor, the loss of Edith was not only a professional trauma, it was deeply personal. He and Stapleton forged a relationship that came through vividly to the public, since it rested on mutual affection and respect. Without Edith, Archie would have to stand alone, and O'Connor knew it would test both his own acting and the tenability of the show. After all, Lear was counting on audiences accepting this change as long as it felt real. The writing team devised a careful scenario for handling Edith's absence. Rather than slaying her in an episode, they gave her death a season off. Thus, the audience would learn of her death by Archie's state of mourning, and not by some dramatic hospital scene or farewell in the nick of time. This decision carried the weight of feeling for the aftermath instead of the event itself, thus giving the show a depth never attempted by most sitcoms. What came next was one of television's most gut-wrenching moments. Archie alone in the silence, Edith left behind. Archie alone. A nation grieves. When the second season of Archie Bunker's Place premiered in the fall of 1980, fans tuned in with a mixture of dread and curiosity. They had heard rumors. They had read news clippings hinting at a painful goodbye. But nothing could fully prepare them for Archie Alone, the two-part episode that would deal with Edith's death. It was one of the most emotional hours in sitcom history, a gut punch that left millions of viewers in tears. The decision to have Edith die off-screen meant that the focus was not on her final moments, but on Archie's grief. Carroll O'Connor carried the weight of that choice with astonishing vulnerability. In the episode, Edith has already passed away from a stroke, and Archie is left stumbling through the fog of denial. At first, he refuses to move her things, clinging to the illusion that she might still walk through the door. He pushes away neighbors and friends who try to console him, snapping with anger, then collapsing into silence. For a character defined by bluster and bravado, Archie's brokenness was startling. Archie is forced to go through Edith's possessions, and it is one of the most memorable scenes. Reluctantly, he begins packing, only to later discover one of her slippers pink underneath the bed. In holding that precious object, as if alluding to Archie's defenses, crumbles. "You had no right to leave me that way," he whispers through tears, breaking down in a way audiences had never seen before. It was raw, unpolished, and devastatingly real. Many fans later said it was the first time they ever saw their fathers cry while watching television. This had not been just Archie's grief, but the grief of an entire nation. For nearly a decade, Edith Bunker was part of American households. Her voice, her laughter, her patience, all these were woven into the very fabric of family life. Losing her, even given that she was a fictional character, was akin to losing someone comfortably familiar. The viewers were mourning not just Edith, but the end of an era. The critics praised the episode for being honest. During a time when serious emotion was shunned by most sitcoms, Archie Alone dared to step forward and present the messy, painful truth about loss. It spared nothing in depicting grief, and had no desire to speed through it. Archie exhibited denial, anger, and finally quiet collapse, stages in mourning that audiences recognized in their own lives. In this respect, the show authorized its audience to mourn not only Edith, but their loved ones as well. The admission of the episode by Carroll O'Connor was that it was one of the most difficult episodes he had ever filmed. He had a true relationship with Jean Stapleton after long years of working together, and the mutual regard and respect that came as a result. Although she was alive and going to other roles, O'Connor said that he would feel as if he had really lost her when he filmed Archie's breakdown. You could see that authenticity shine through on screen, making this performance one of the best of his career. What made Archie Alone even more extraordinary was how it shattered the glass ceiling of television storytelling. Comedies were historically great sources of easy laughs and happy endings. Yet, in this episode, tragedy ran deep, and laughter and tears were not opposed, but rather supplementary. Much in the same way, Edith's absence lent the show a maturity it had never fully received. Growing up required forcing Archie and America to grow up. Even after her death, Edith would continue to influence the story. For Archie, grief would become an ongoing theme that he dealt with as he came to try to adjust to life, sans Edith. The absence of her comforting touch made that void truly felt. This was the first time the audience realized how much Archie had depended on Edith, since he was so obviously fragile in her absence. But everything seemed to remain, even as she departed, all vowing to unite her viewers' recall of the irreplaceable vacuum she left in both Archie's and their lives. And while audiences mourned, Stapleton quietly forged a new path for herself. Life after Edith. For audiences, Edith Bunker's death felt final. For Jean Stapleton, however, it marked the beginning of a new journey. Stepping away from a role that had defined her for nearly a decade was risky. Many actors never escape the shadow of their most famous characters, and Stapleton knew she carried the weight of Edith wherever she went. Yet rather than retreat, she embraced the challenge of building a life and career after the dingbat. Almost immediately, Stapleton pursued roles that showcased her range. She had spent years proving she could embody a housewife from Queens, but her heart had always belonged to the stage. Returning to the theater felt like returning home. She performed in touring productions of classics like Arsenic and Old Lace and The Gin Game, as well as in Shakespearean roles that reminded audiences of her dramatic chops. By taking these parts, she sent a clear message. Jean Stapleton was not Edith Bunker. The new television opportunities opened up for Stapleton to accept selected roles that sharply contrasted with her former image. They took her into a hodgepodge of series types, from drama to comedy, playing guest spots on such widely different shows as Murphy Brown and Touched by an Angel. These kinds of performances also gave her a chance to exercise different creative demands. Sometimes she played strong-willed, no-nonsense women, the very antithesis of Edith in her soft-spoken role. And then there were times she embraced kooky characters in a different spirit. Stapleton acted very intentionally in these choices. She didn't want to erase Edith, though she certainly would not let her be the only voice she had. Stapleton made illustrious film appearances as well. She was seen in Michael, an angel comedy starring John Travolta, giving warmth to a quirky role, and she worked on little cable television movies, often choosing projects that resonated with her personal beliefs. Fame was not for Stapleton. It was about acting, living other people's lives, and telling their stories. Yet, no matter how many roles she played, interviews and public appearances always circled back to Edith. Stapleton handled this with grace. She never expressed bitterness about being remembered primarily for one role. Instead, she acknowledged Edith's importance while gently reminding people that she was an actress capable of much more. "She is not me," Stapleton once said of Edith, "but I understood her." That distinction was crucial. Stapleton could honor Edith without being consumed by her. As years went by, Stapleton in many ways faded out of the limelight. By about 2000, she had retired from acting, leaving a record that likely ran far beyond Queens. She was inducted into the Television Hall of Fame in 2002, and that was a tribute worthy of both Edith and the woman who portrayed her. Edith was adored by the fans, while Stapleton was respected by her peers for her integrity, courage, and her choice never to be defined by one role. The story of Stapleton's life after Edith is one of reinventing herself again and again. Superstardom didn't interest her, nor did she capitalize on the fame that Edith had bestowed upon her. She chose meaningful projects, stayed true to herself, and made certain that when history remembered her, it would not be just for one sitcom. And in that quiet, sensible way, she proved that Edith Bunker was actually not an end, but a beginning. Still, Edith wasn't gone from history. Her memory fueled something much larger than television. The Edith Bunker legacy. When Edith Bunker died on television, it wasn't just the end of a character, it was the beginning of a legacy that reached far beyond sitcom storytelling. Rarely had a fictional figure been mourned with such sincerity, and rarer still was what followed. Edith Bunker became more than entertainment. She became a cultural icon whose influence stretched into social issues, feminism, and even politics. Norman Lear understood that Edith wasn't just beloved, she was symbolic. Soon after her death on Archie Bunker's place, he helped establish the Edith Bunker Memorial Fund, a groundbreaking initiative that supported the fight for women's rights. With an initial contribution of $500,000, the fund worked toward the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, placing Edith's name alongside one of the most important social movements of the 20th century. This was unprecedented. A fictional character being honored in such a tangible, activist way demonstrated just how deeply Edith had resonated with audiences. She wasn't merely a housewife from Queens. She was a representative of countless real women whose voices often went unheard. It is a paradox that made Edith's legacy. She wrote as scatterbrained, subservient, and, at times, clueless. Actors understood these characteristics as the moral compass of the show. Through Jean Stapleton, the performance showed Edith's weaknesses transformed into strength. She was empathetic, loyal, and unfailingly kind, qualities that starkly contrasted with Archie's prejudice and stubbornness. She did not raise her voice and strike with fiery speeches. Rather, Edith shrouded herself in dignified endurance. It is this discreet power that made Edith echo strongly with 70s American womanhood. Feminism was on the rise, questioning gender roles and demanding rights. Edith may have been fictional, but in many ways, she portrayed the actual experience of many housewives. Ignored, underestimated, but oh so important. She worked at marriage with patience, embraced parenthood, and endured life's trials with grit. When Edith stood up to Archie, declaring her position on menopause, facing health scares, or asserting her own autonomy, she demonstrated an everyday courage that, through the generations, felt recognizably attainable. Her legacy also included television. Edith, in the way of other sitcom wives and mothers, made her own way, letting them too attain levels of complexity. I suspect a lot of characters, from Roseanne Connor to Marge Simpson to Carmela Soprano, owe something to Edith. She demonstrated that a woman on television could be funny, imperfect, and very human without being an ex-anything. In so many ways, she was the anti-June Cleaver, breaking the mold for the perfect housewife and making room for authenticity. Even decades later, Edith's memory is still important. New generations keep her memory alive through reruns of All in the Family, and her character is still studied in academic discussions on media and gender. Critics revisit her episodes to analyze how sitcoms took on taboo issues, while fans still post their favorite Edith moments on websites. Edith has a rich cultural afterlife because she was never just a prop for laughs. She spoke to something universal. But perhaps the greatest proof of Edith's impact is how All in the Family shaped every sitcom that followed. How One Goodbye changed TV forever. When Jean Stapleton chose to step away, and Edith Bunker's death was written into Archie Bunker's place, it did more than shock audiences. It fundamentally altered the way television treated its characters, its stories, and even its viewers. Until that moment, sitcoms had largely been comfort food, predictable, safe, and rarely daring to confront the harsher realities of life. Edith's goodbye shattered that mold. Her departure signaled that television could handle grief with the same seriousness as laughter, that sitcoms could teach just as much as they entertained. The immediate impact was clear. Archie Alone, the episode that revealed Edith's passing, became one of the most talked about moments in TV history. Critics hailed it as a landmark in storytelling, while fans described it as both devastating and cathartic. For the first time, a sitcom had given audiences permission to cry without offering easy consolation. It showed that the loss of a beloved character could be treated not as a gimmick, but as a profound human experience. That bravery elevated sitcoms into a new category of art. This event started sending ripples further down the years, even into the television industry. Writers and producers coming after this realized that the audience had a stronger grip on him of complexity. They did not need to end every episode on a laugh or a happy note. Shows like Cheers, Roseanne, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Friends, and The Office experimented with the balance of comedy and tragedy, looking back towards, on account of, the death of Edith. With the door opened for authenticity, so did the making of a dramedy tradition that pervades the TV space today. The death of Edith also revamped the character of Archie Bunker. Archie, without Edith to balance him, became more vulnerable, more human, and in some instances, more tragic. Viewers, who had once laughed at his bluster, now saw the loneliness behind it. The show evolved from Archie ranting about everything to Archie simply trying to survive. This transition proved that sitcom characters can grow and change, and even suffer like the very audience watching them. It was an almost invisible but radical leap in portraying humanity on television. From an industry perspective, Edith's demise set a precedent. It taught networks and writers that slaying major characters could become more than a shocking stunt. It could be a storytelling decision that increased narrative stakes. Decades later, shows from MASH to Game of Thrones to This Is Us would lean on this same type of power. But Edith was one of the first. Her death showed audiences that they would not abandon a show simply because it broke their hearts. In fact, it often made them more loyal to it. Culturally, the farewell of Edith became one of America's great shared memories. Families watched Archie mourn, and thus confronted loss experiences of their own. Many viewers composed letters to CBS, telling how the episode Jim died helped them discuss death in their households. Such group grieving through entertainment was unheard of in those days. Television was dismissed as a superficial diversion suddenly proved itself capable of providing comfort, a cathartic release, and even healing. In the end, it was not only about saying goodbye to one character or even one series, but also about growing up. It was about showing how comedy could hold tragedy in its arms, how some laughs could share the stage with some tears, and about an actress who considered her art too precious. She was willing to risk it for leaving, knowing that her greatest gift to audiences was leaving them with a memory that would never fade. Jean Stapleton didn't just leave a role. She changed television history. Edith Bunker's death forced audiences to confront grief, equality, and the fragility of family. If you loved Edith, share your favorite moment in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more deep dives, and watch the next one on your screen to keep the nostalgia alive.